On March 16th, 2010, we witnessed a murder. The fumbled and failed release of Command & Conquer 4 marked the death of another beloved franchise by the cold corporate hands of EA. But today, from the ashes, a new hope is rising. Tempest Rising is the first big budget RTS we've had in a while, and I know reviews are supposed to wait until the end to say it, but I'm gonna say it now. The game is a damn good time. It isn't perfect. In fact, there are some pretty major issues I'll talk about later, but if you take anything away from this video, let it be that after such a long drought of RTS campaigns, it is so good to be back. This video is kind of a review and mostly just talking about a new game that I like, but there won't be any sort of story spoilers outside of the first couple missions, so don't fret. So let's talk about Tempest Rising, the good, the meh, and the unfortunate bad. Starting off with the campaign. Tempest Rising is, by all interpretations, a love letter to Command & Conquer, taking everything that made both the Tiberium and Red Alert sagas great, mashing them together, and tossing them into a modern engine that feels a lot less clunky to play. And the moment I booted into the campaign, it was clear that Slipgate Ironworks fundamentally understands what Command & Conquer is. We start off on a briefing that unfortunately isn't campy green screen, where our boy Colonel Fisher gives us a sit-rep. As an aside, the only character's name I perfectly remember is Mr. Fisher here, and that's because this game takes place in 1997, and my third grade teacher in the 90s was Mrs. Fisher, who I assume is the Colonel's wife. They're so cute together. The TLDR is that World War III happened, leaving large swaths of the world irradiated, and from the fallout started growing Tempest, a plant-like being that thrums with electricity. And everybody wants it. We're playing as a commander of the Global Defense Force, or GDF, and our scouts have found that the Tempest dynasty are messing around in Iceland, harvesting our Tempest.
Intelligence has a situation brewing in Iceland.
You're the one operating near Flotstadtstierna, right?
Things look pretty good in these briefings, but Fisher's mouth movements are a bit uncanny valley, and it's clear that the devs agree because almost every other character ends up wearing a mask or doesn't move their mouth to talk. After being debriefed about the Tempest dynasty, we're sent into the first mission, but not before getting a little cinematic. And wow, do these look solid. The majority of the game's cutscenes, particularly in the early parts, aren't big plot moments or character arcs, but instead thematic world building, vaguely related to the missions at hand. And I think that's perfect for introducing a new world. It really helps establish the Tempest and how important it is. It sets the stage for whatever is about to come. The campaign starts off fairly normal, with an introduction to movement and attacking, explosive barrels, getting a few units, explosive barrels, saving some allies, and explosive barrels. This game freaking loves explosive barrels, and I honestly just find it funny at this point. They are everywhere. I just assume they have the intern Barrel Bjorn, and he just put the barrels everywhere. That was his one job. And you know what, Bjorn? You absolutely killed it. The main thing I noticed, besides the barrels, is that these missions are long. There's never one major objective, but always 4 or 5 to progress through, and near the end of the campaign, it's more like 8 or 9 per mission, and that's not including the bonuses. While the beginning missions start off fairly basic, teaching the fundamentals of the faction and production, once we hit the mid-game, the variety in missions is pretty impressive. There are convoy ambushes, commando raids, rescue operations, defensive holdouts, fortress sieges, and pure abject chaos. Most of the mission objectives boil down to either capturing or killing an objective, but Tempest Rising does a good job at differentiating the missions through theming. It very easily could have gotten stale quickly, but it doesn't. And the meta progression is pretty interesting. There are a series of progression lines called doctrines that can be unlocked to give powerful bonuses, and an armory where you get to spend cash to fill these little square things with modules. The doctrines are all built around improving the main faction, but the armory upgrades can be pretty wild, with upgrades like swapping out your unit's weapons for lasers, making your vehicles drop infantry when destroyed, or just straight up stealing tech from the other faction to use. You unlock 1 square per mission, and the highest cost for an upgrade is 4 squares. And all armory upgrades are available from the start, meaning you can do some really crazy things pretty quickly here. And you're given a ton of money for beating objectives, and you get multiple full refunds if you need them. Though in my playthrough there was a bug where I somehow ended up with negative resets, I'm gonna assume that'll get patched. The system is a little bit overwhelming at first due to the massive amount of choice given with no context, but it does add a lot of flexibility and replay value, which is cool. After beating basically every mission, I went, oh yeah, next time I want to use this or that upgrade instead, and it'll be awesome. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a really good system. Just like Command & Conquer, the game's 2 campaigns take place at the same time as each other. They're designed so that they can be played in either order, though I do recommend playing the GDF first because I think the intrigue for the final act build-up is better there. Even though these stories take place at the same time and are both canon, the story does a good job at being very separate for the large majority of the campaign. It's not retreading the same thing twice, but instead 2 roads that converge at the same destination. The repetition has always been a frustration of mine in old CNC games, and I'm happy to see that it was addressed. Overall, the mission quality and variety are both high. Not only are the missions fun, but the locations are varied, interesting, and honestly beautiful. The map design particularly is fairly great overall, with a lot of time being taken to make sure that there are always multiple ways to approach a problem. I never felt like I had to shove everything through the square hole. Between each mission, during the briefing, there's also a few questions we can ask whoever we're talking to. They're very obvious exposition dumps, and I'm glad that they're there, though I wish they were a little bit more character focused. The game seriously lacks interesting characters. I couldn't tell you the first thing about anybody besides their name and their job. Overall, I enjoyed both campaigns. There are 11 missions each, and on insane difficulty, it took me 11 hours per campaign, for about 22 hours in total. Though my friend who played on normal said it only took him about 6 hours to complete one campaign. So insane might be the exception here. This mode's difficulty lives up to its name, and it is a ridiculous grind at times. The actual minute-to-minute gameplay is exactly what you would expect from this subgenre. Build interface and minimap on the right-hand side, super easy to macro with the mouse instead of a bunch of hotkeys, though if you do want to use hotkeys, start stretching those fingers because they use the F keys and it goes all the way to F12. Which hilariously is the default screenshot hotkey for Steam, so every time you want to make an assault gunner as the GDF, you can savor the moment forever. Units also die ridiculously fast, or ridiculously slow. There are 6 types of damage: cannon, rifle, explosive, rocket, which apparently don't explode, flame, and sniper. And it seems like the large majority of units have either 0% damage reduction or 75% damage reduction against each type. The in-betweens are fairly rare, making unit counters very hard. As a result, the game's more about specialists. The well-rounded units tend to pale in comparison to the purpose-built tools. Tempest is the resource that you harvest and turn into credits, which for the Dynasty, it's the only resource. But the GDF have a second resource called Intel. Various abilities mark enemies, and when killed, they provide intel, which can be spent to buy units or abilities. I think the system's pretty good overall. It does force you into always having the ability to mark, but getting and spending the intel does feel like a fun little minigame that's very rewarding. The stuff you get from intel is much stronger than the standard GDF kit. You get a little bit of kid in the candy shop vibe when you have some to spend early on. Though later in the campaign, I was swimming in thousands of intel every mission and couldn't possibly spend it all. One thing the formula does really well is make sure the game's super easy to pick up and start playing. Age of Empires and StarCraft are frankly a bit much for new players, but having production be so mouse-oriented means you don't need to memorize multiple control groups and hotkeys to make basic units. Also, thank you for not adding some stupid minimap mechanic. In a lot of similar games, you have to buy your minimap in some way, and I know it's thematic or whatever, but hard pass. I'm already unobservant enough, I don't need the game handicapping me there too. Armies themselves control okay, stuff feels very rigid and does clip into each other all the time, but I was very rarely raging at my units not moving well. It did happen on occasion though, mostly when trying to use dropships, which are a serious pain to transport units around with. On the other hand, if you do want to do some seriously cool stuff with dropships, engineers will repair when garrisoned inside of vehicles or structures, and drone operators fight via drones, which hover around the garrisoned target instead of going inside, meaning the Sky Crane can be turned into less of a transport and more of a bootleg self-repairing drone carrier, and it's super freaking sweet. I love it when the devs just let you do wacky stuff like that. It really adds to the charm of the game. But to pull off a bunch of wacky stuff, the factions actually have to be interesting. So are they? They're okay. Currently there are 2 playable factions, though it has been confirmed for quite a while that there will be a third one coming in the future. But right now, I can talk mainly about the GDF and the Tempest Dynasty. The GDF is very similar to the GDI that they were inspired from. A global coalition formed to defeat their foes and secure world order and get lots of Tempest in the process. They're a fairly stock standard faction, with generic military units like tanks and infantry on the lower tiers. What sets them apart is a focus on drone warfare, some cool laser stuff, and fancy intel units, like the Scrambler, a rocket-launching stealth ambush hover tank with an absurdly powerful area damage ability. The core GDF stuff is pretty uninspired, but at higher techs, the units are pretty fun. The Dynasty is a bit more interesting, with lots of Tempest energy being infused into their higher tech units. They also have a couple wacky things like anti-building piledriver man and electric death physics lady. And of course, the Sphere. I particularly love the Tempest spheres. I'm not convinced that they're actually good, but rolling around with your ball boys and crushing everything in sight like you're about to bowl 300 is lovely. Also, the Dynasty likes flamethrowers, which who doesn't? Good choice. Overall, the two factions have fairly generic cores and are more interesting in the supplemental and specialist units. I personally would have preferred a bit more wild experimentation, but I'm pretty sure we'll be seeing that in the future. The third faction is not playable yet, and doesn't have a campaign, so I'm not going to talk about them here. But from everything we've seen so far, they're looking to be pretty interesting. In my opinion, far more so than the other factions. I am looking forward to using them in the future, and once the faction roster is more rounded out with the wild design of the third, I think the more standard stuff will end up being pretty okay as introductory stuff, which every game needs. The game does have a few major issues that I would like to see addressed over time. The first is the aircraft. They decided to make literally everything a helicopter, meaning that instead of rapid speed, high-octane airstrikes, aircraft sort of meander slowly over to their target and then drop grenades on people's heads like it's World War I. This is particularly bad for the Condor Bomber, which I think is the single lamest unit in the game. I really like the vibe of airstrikes and air support coming in fast and hot and then jetting off, and that's pretty rare here. The only option is one GDF support power. I do quite like the Dynasty Leveler though. It's basically a flying rocket artillery system and it feels great to use. Another problem I have is that there's no 3v3 or 4v4 maps in skirmish mode, which is a very easy fix and massive oversight. People teaming up with their friends to comp stomp in team games is a very common post-campaign play pattern and should be easier for people to do. But the biggest disappointment I have is the lack of really big high-tier units and super weapons. Currently, the tech tree sort of feels like it stops at tier 2.5, and something to cap things off is just missing. I want WMDs made from Tempest. I want some sort of iconic big old capital ship and mobile land fortress for the factions. Something huge and imposing that really sells the fantasy of the GDF or Dynasty. Make it prohibitively expensive or whatever so it doesn't ruin multiplayer balance, that's fine. It's for the cool factor anyway. I think these small tweaks would go a long way towards helping carve out each faction's identity and make them feel more complete. Everything's currently on the right path, but it could be taken up a notch. Looping back to skirmish mode, it exists. The bots range from brain dead to Giga Chad difficulty, and while 3v3 and 4v4 don't exist, 1s, 2s, and free-for-alls do. The entire thing is pretty bare bones. It's got ranked matchmaking and private lobbies, but the map count is very small right now and definitely is in need of some updating. Hopefully they give the community some sort of tools to do map design here. I don't know if the game has those potentially available, but I would love to see what the community could cook up. And that's about it for the game's supplementary content. It really is a game that the large majority of players are going to buy for the campaign, and I think that's fine because it's appropriately priced for that. Tempest Rising is $40 and has no microtransactions. In a world where people are starting to charge upwards of double that for a game and include an in-game shop, I think the value is fair. The final thing I wanted to talk about is everything else. The supplemental stuff. If you were cooler than me, you would call it the vibe. Tempest Rising nails its vibe. It knows exactly what it wants to be and is exactly that. The HUD and aesthetic are high quality and look very cool. Loading screens, briefing menus, and all that jazz look phenomenal. They brought on Frank Klepacki for the soundtrack, and that man is the John Williams of RTS music. The only whiffs, in my opinion, are a few things like the voice lines. They use muffled old radio effects a lot, and I get it, it fits the era, but this is what it sounds like when you're controlling a Dynasty army when you have a salvage van in it. It gets old pretty quickly. It sounds like I'm raiding with someone on Ventrilo in 2004. It's not a deal breaker, but it's a bit over the top. The final thing that the game lacks is a fun character. There's no Kane or Yuri or George Takei or Tim Curry. Nobody that I get a big grin when they appear on the screen. I hope that for the third faction campaign, they work on that. I would love to have somebody with a more inherently charismatic or intriguing nature appear. The actual plot is fun, and the ending missions to both campaigns are very good. I think just a bit more of an investment in a truly great character would bring things over the top. But there is one final out-of-game vibe killer that everybody should be aware of: the license agreement. Section 13.5 of the EULA states that they reserve the right to log all the information of your computer's RAM and a bunch of other stuff while the game is open, and then anonymize it and share it with third-party sources, which of course is code for selling it. Some people claim that everybody is harvesting your data anyway, so this is a drop in the bucket, and others think it's a gross overstepping of their privacy and incredibly invasive. I'm not here to lecture you, just to give you the information to make your personal best informed decision. That's what they do, and whether or not you're cool with that is your personal choice. So, putting everything together, do I recommend Tempest Rising? If you're okay with all the privacy stuff, absolutely. The campaigns are great, the world is beautiful, and the factions are interesting. The story has a lot of future potential, and I'm interested to see where it goes in the future. I would love to see the third faction, some super weapons, and a final capstone unit for each faction be added. If we can get all of that, I'm gonna be a happy guy. Thanks for watching. It's really weird being able to be happy and excited over an RTS release for the first time in forever. Also, the devs deserve props for releasing a game that runs well and is basically bug-free. Tempest Rising is fun and a polished experience. So look forward to next time when I break it in half and do it deathless.